The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome, wherever you may be and whenever you might be listening to another edition of Ask Claire along the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Claire Hall, happy to be your host today, and if you are a regular listener, you know that we have some favorite topics on here: baseball, books, and of course, books about baseball. And I am really happy to welcome back to the program a guest I had on several months ago, Peter Goldenbock. How are you today, Peter?
I'm just fine, Claire, just fine.
Okay, well, last time around we talked about Dynasty, your great book about the Yankees of the Casey Stengel era. But today I want to hop boroughs and head over to Brooklyn. And, I want to talk about not only your oral history of the Brooklyn Dodgers called Bums, but what really seems to me, at least, to be very much a companion piece, a book you called In the Country of Brooklyn. So, in the next 28 minutes or so, if we can talk a little bit about the history of the Dodgers, the history of Brooklyn, how they influenced each other, and why it is really such a compelling and unique story. It's been 62 years since the last Brooklyn Dodger game, and yet I think they have a far more passionate following than any of the other defunct baseball teams.
Yeah, they certainly do. There's no question about that.
Yeah, so tell us Bums came first. Tell us how you came to do that and some of the highlights of your experience.
Well, yeah, Bums certainly came first. After I did Dynasty, and then I had the Bronx Zoo with Sparky Lyle, and then I did did number one with Billy Martin.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 10 years old, my uncle Justin took me to the fourth game of the World Series, which was between the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I, of course, was a Yankee fan, had been since, I guess, really only the year before, 1955. 1955 was really the first year that I really started following baseball. But living in Stamford, Connecticut, we were New York metropolitan. We were Yankee fans. And, exactly why Uncle Justin invited me to this rather than his own son, I have no idea. But Uncle Justin was Jackie Robinson's attorney.
Oh, my gosh.
And so after we watched the game, which the Yankees won 4-2 behind Tom Sturdivant, after the game, he and I went down below to meet with Jackie. Jackie was moving to Stamford, Connecticut, which was the town I lived in, and my uncle had something to do with that. Exactly what, I'm not sure. I was 10 years old. But but he introduced me to Jackie, who seemed to be about 9 feet tall, and we shook hands, and his hand certainly enveloped mine. And, it made an impression. I have sort of had two baseball heroes in my life, and one of them was Mickey Mantle, and that was because I was a Yankee fan. And the other one was Jackie Robinson, and that was because of Uncle Justin and because I had met him. And so, another friend of mine was Roger Kahn, who had written The Boys of Summer. Mm-hmm. And The Boys of Summer was really about the 1952 and 1953 Brooklyn Dodgers. Those were 2 years when Roger was covering the Dodgers for the New York World Herald and Tribune, or maybe just the Tribune. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, he was the beat reporter, and as far as I'm concerned, the Boys of Summer, at least the first half of the Boys of Summer, was the most literate, finely written sports book that I've ever seen. It was just tremendous. And so, one of the things I got to do when I was writing Bums, when I got the contract to do this oral history of the Brooklyn Dodgers, was to, call Roger and meet with Roger. And he was tremendously helpful. He couldn't have been nicer. I was this young kid, and he was this, wizened, experienced reporter. And so that was wonderful. And one of the other things that was wonderful as well in doing this book, in addition to meeting and interviewing Duke Snyder and Carl Furillo and Pee Wee Reese and Roy Campanella, Don Newcomb, Carl Erskine, who was such a gentleman, I had the opportunity to interview Rachel Robinson. And the only reason I got the chance to interview Rachel Robinson, once again, it was because my Uncle Justin was their lawyer. And so she trusted me. She trusted me to interview her. And of course, when you're writing a history of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the main focus of that, if you have any sense of American history, is Jackie Robinson signing with Branch Rickey and becoming the first African American to break the color line, and to just turn the country upside down, which is what he did.
Oh yeah. I some of my younger friends, I say, you've got to realize what a pioneering place Jackie was in. That was before Harry Truman desegregated the military, years before the Brown versus Board of Education decision. He was truly a pioneer for civil rights.
You know what I found so interesting is that I wrote this book somewhere around 1983, 1984, and I do believe it really was the very first book that ever, put Jackie Robinson into his proper context in terms of the civil rights movement. I do think that without Jackie Robinson becoming the success that he became, it's very possible you would have not had the future successes of Martin Luther King. But Jackie Robinson opened up the whole world to the African American community to show them that he was just as good as any white guy, if not better, which of course made a lot of the people in the South absolutely furious. But how he overcame the obstacles that he came was as much a focus of this book, Bums, as anything else in the book. And to interview his teammates about Robinson, I just thought that was absolutely fascinating.
I'm sure.
My favorite moment was interesting. I was interviewing Rex Barney, and Rex Barney was the PR announcer for the Baltimore Orioles for years and years and years. And we're sitting in a restaurant, and I'm interviewing him, and he proceeds to tell me the story of this game that he was pitching in Cincinnati. And the fans in Cincinnati were booing Jackie something terrible. At which point, this was before the game, at which point Pee Wee Reese walked across the field and put his arms around Jackie's shoulders. And the entire ballpark just shut up. All that racist crap. Pee Wee Reese basically, because Pee Wee was from Louisville, which was across the river. Pee Wee was a Southerner. Basically, Pee Wee told all these people, "Why don't you just shut up?" And that was also a fairly important conversation that I had, because I couldn't get that story out of my head. I thought, this is a moment, like Rosa Parks not refusing to sit in the back of the bus, that sort of thing. And it took me 5 years, but I was able to convince a publisher to do a children's book, which was called Teammates, which was the story of how Pee Wee Reese walked across that diamond and put his arms around Jackie Robinson's shoulders as if to say, he is my teammate.
Exactly.
So it's just interesting. It's just interesting how these things happen. But I had the opportunity to interview 40-something the Dodgers and Rachel Robinson. And I was just, fortunate that I was at a time when these people were still alive. Clem Levine was still alive. Ed Roebuck was still alive. Nuke was still alive.
Yep.
It's just, I was at the right place at the right time.
Very much so. And the story about Jackie and Pee Wee at Cincinnati, very well could have been lost to history otherwise. But, then, of course, a few years ago, it was immortalized in the movie 42. But do you want to weigh in at all on these revisionists who are trying to claim that it's all a myth, it didn't really happen? It must be kind of exasperating, to say the least.
Well, I mean, this was something in I think the 10th inning of the baseball, the fabulous baseball series by the fellow from New Hampshire. What's his name?
Ken Burns.
Ken Burns.
Yeah.
Rex Barney told me it happened. Pee Wee Reese certainly told me it happened because he wrote the, sort of the introduction to Teammates. So I know it happened. So for a couple of the reporters to somehow announce that this thing never happened, I don't get it. I don't get it at all. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I've probably sold more than 1 million Teammates, so they can say whatever they want.
Very good. So maybe this would be a good opportunity to segue to what In the Country of Brooklyn is all about, your motivation for writing it, the story you were looking to tell.
Well, the interesting thing about the Jackie Robinson story, of course, was that, Branch Rickey was one of the owners and the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Chances are, if he had wanted to integrate the league, he probably could not have done it in St. Louis or Chicago or Philadelphia or some of these other places. And so, one day I was just sort of thinking to myself, why was it that Jackie was embraced, and more than embraced, he was loved by the whites who lived in Brooklyn? Well, first, of course, they loved they loved their Dodgers in Brooklyn, and so so I have a friend of mine, Professor Doranson at LIU, and he had a baseball weekend, celebrating baseball that I had attended, and I sat with him, and he gave me 7 or 8 of his friends to interview about this issue. And it turned out that the real reason why the Dodgers were so beloved in Brooklyn was that Brooklyn was an incredibly liberal and progressive place. Many of the people who lived there were Jews. They were Irish. They were Italians. But the Jews, who had their own problems, more than anybody else, really embraced Jackie Robinson. And it turned out that the people who lived in Brooklyn, were incredibly, liberal as people. They were people involved in the civil rights movement, and I interviewed some of them for this book. They were people who were themselves persecuted by the various right-wing, anti-communist, the McCarthy era, for instance. One of the fellows I interviewed, wonderful person. Let me see if I can find him here. Henry Foner. Henry Foner was one of 4 brothers. All 4 Foner brothers were professors, and all 4 brothers were accused of being communists. Now, what happened was, in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of New Yorkers embraced communism because communism at the time stood for the civil rights movement. At the time, the Republicans had no interest in the civil rights movement. The Democrats had no interest in the civil rights movement. The only group that had an interest in treating African Americans fairly were the communists. And a lot of these people embraced communism for that reason. And then, of course, what happened, Stalin took over in I think, 1933 or something like that, and it became clear that communism was a really terrible, terrible thing. You know, the idea of communism supposedly was to spread the wealth, but in fact what happened was this dictator took over in Russia and basically, you know, started killing 20 million people. So the idea that these people love communism, you know, disappeared fairly quickly for these people.
Yeah.
But what McCarthy did and what these other anti-communists did was to attack these people for being communists no matter when they were communists.
Right.
And if you were even accused of being a communist, the likelihood was, the almost certainty was, that you were going to lose your job. So the four Foner brothers, who were all professors and teachers, all lost their jobs and had to do something else. Along with hundreds and hundreds of others, you know, Jewish, you know, Jews who at one point had been, you know, members of the Communist Party. I mean, this whole thing with McCarthyism was a sham in a way, because nobody during this whole time was ever accused of, you know, actually doing anything to hurt the country. You know, the only two people who were executed were actually spies, and those were the Rosenbergs.
Yeah.
And there's still a question to this day whether Mrs. Rosenberg had anything to do with it. You know, so one of those relatives was arrested, and he sort of threw Mrs. Rosenberg to the wolves so that he would have, you know, he wouldn't get the death penalty. So I mean, it was very, very ugly. It was a terrible state tragic state for our country. It happened a couple times. There was the Red Scare. There was the Red Scare back in 1919, 1920, 1921, and then there was McCarthyism again in the mid-40s, going up through the mid-50s. I mean, it's you know, this anti-immigration, anti-African Americans. I mean, you're seeing it today, you know, in the Trump administration. It's really, you know, it's terrible for this country, and I just hope we can get through it this time. I'm hopeful, but not positive.
Yeah.
So that's what In the Country was about. I was able to interview all these wonderful people. I interviewed Neil Sedaka. He came from Lincoln High School. He sang "Calendar Girl" for me, which was fantastic. I interviewed Brucey Murrow. I interviewed the most wonderful John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin was the most famous of African American historians. John Hope had actually been hired by Brooklyn College to teach there, and he told me the story of how difficult it was for him to find a place to live. I mean, wonderful, wonderful stories. Curtis Sliwa certainly was somebody there. One of the interesting people, Monty Irvin.
Yes.
He was not from Brooklyn, of course, but I had the opportunity one evening to pick him up at his home in Ocala and take him to St. Petersburg for a little colloquy that we had where he was one of the speakers. And I asked him if I could interview him during our, you know, hour and 15-minute trip, and he said, well, of course you can. And what he told me was something that he had never, ever told anybody else, and I put it in this book, and that was that Branch Rickey had asked Monty Irvin to be the first black to integrate baseball, even before he had asked Jackie Robinson. And Monty Irvin told me, he said, Mr. Rickey, the experiences that I have had in the Army during the last 3 years working for these cracker officers, my nerves are shot. I am so on edge that I can barely, you know, breathe. I'm just not the person to do this.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Pretty powerful story. you think of historical what ifs, and that's sure one of them.
I know
But this
I know
all
it.
comes together, people uniting. Yeah, I just came across a clip on YouTube with some Brooklyn Dodgers footage and voiceover from Branch Rickey. And I had never heard this phrase before, but I absolutely loved it. Mr. Rickey called Ebbets Field the Cathedral of the Underdog. Isn't that just perfect?
Yeah.
The Cathedral
But
of
the
the
interesting
Underdog.
thing, of course, is that after Mr. Rickey put together his farm system and brought all these fabulous people to the Dodgers, they weren't underdogs anymore. So maybe he was talking. Maybe he was talking about the fans. He might well have been talking about the fans. Yeah.
Because it was really, kind of in some ways Brooklyn against Manhattan, Brooklyn against the world. I've sensed that some people, maybe still haven't gotten over the fact that Brooklyn lost its identity as a separate city and got merged into Greater New York, even though that's been more than almost 120 years now.
No Brooklynite of a certain age, and I'm telling you this because I've met many of them since writing Bums. No Brooklynite of a certain age has ever forgiven Walter O'Malley for leaving Brooklyn and going to Los Angeles. And yet it turns out it wasn't entirely Walter O'Malley's fault. Roy Campanella told me that O'Malley wanted to build a dome stadium at the corner of Atlantic Avenue and Flatbush. And he was stopped from doing so by Robert Moses. Robert Moses wanted him to take the team to where Shea Stadium ended up in Queens, and O'Malley did not want to do that, and Moses wouldn't give an inch. And so he really felt he had no choice, and so he took the team to Los Angeles.
Yeah, two very strong-willed men, neither one of them willing to yield an inch. And, it's really a shame because I think, just in a lot of reasons, but the success that the Mets enjoyed right out of the gate, with the fans, even if they weren't an artistic success, showed that New York very much was and always will be a two-team town. There's room for two teams, and so the Dodgers, is there a certain, Peter, would you say maybe romanticism now attached to their memory simply because they are a memory that always kind of fixed in the past, and would the pull be so strong, if we didn't have your wonderful books or Boys of Summer kind of just pulling us back into what seems like to a lot of people a better and simpler time?
It's hard to know. I mean, it's like thinking about your deceased parents. It's like that. It's part of your childhood. It's part of your growing up. And these were people who were important to them. And then all of a sudden, one day, it was announced that Ebbets Field was going to become an apartment complex, and the team was going to move to Los Angeles. And a lot of those people became Mets fans. That's what happened. Certainly, they couldn't root for the Yankees. They hated the Yankees. So they became Mets. They became Mets fans.
I mean, that's really a big part of the reason. Isn't it pretty clear? I mean, in the beginning, the Mets loaded up on as many former Brooklyn Dodgers as they could. Gil Hodges, Roger Craig, Don Zimmer,
Snyder,
Charlie Neal. That's
right. Made perfect sense.
Heck, Yep. Even though it didn't make for much success on the field, the
National League totally screwed the Mets. When the American League expanded, they set it up in such a way that the two American League teams, what was it, Minnesota and Washington, Minnesota and the Angels, the two American League expansion teams were somehow able to get very, very good players. They only allowed the existing teams to hang on to a small number of players so that decent players were available to the two expansion teams. when it came time for the Houston Astros and the Mets to draft players, basically they kept everybody but 2 players, something like that. So the people those 2 teams had to draft were, over the hill rejects or, kids who had never made it. And so Houston actually did a better job of drafting than the Mets did. Houston actually became, fairly decent fairly soon. Took the Mets 5 or 6 years to get there.
But once they did, what an amazing story in itself, and that's the title of another one of your great books. Maybe we can talk about that someday on a future show, but we're running up against our half hour, I suppose. Peter, any final thoughts on Brooklyn and her beloved, never-to-be-forgotten Dodgers?
Well, it's a wonderful memory. It was a great time, a great place. Still is a great place. Got a lot more expensive than it used to be.
Oh, yeah. But the Dodgers of Brooklyn. Peter Goldenbock, author of Bums, of In the Country of Brooklyn, and of many, many other great books. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today on Ask Claire.
My pleasure.
Look forward to talking again sometime. And
take care. Have a great New Year. All you fans out there, have a wonderful, wonderful Merry Christmas and a very, very Happy New Year. Take care.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.